Let's get joined up. Today's show is brought to you by Audible, and right now you can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/joinedup. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle or MP3 player. So thanks for tuning in to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, a regular show about all things writing, including interviews with authors, screenwriters and key figures from the publishing industry. Plus loads of hints, tips and inspiration for all creatives. You can follow us on Twitter at JU Podcast, leave a quick iTunes review or just tell a friend. Right, cue that new theme tune. Yes, hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. What did you think to the new music, by the way? That's the rockier version, but there's also another theme that's a bit more funk influenced. Thanks again to George Odom of Go Guitar Lessons who helped me with that. And I'll use the funkier one maybe for next week's episode, and you can tell me which one you prefer. Anyway, I'm Wayne Kelly, and it's episode 123 with Kate Harrison today. Kate's got tons of experience, having written loads of books across multiple genres within fiction and non-fiction. And during the interview, I also asked Kate to critique my own query letter, and let's just say she gives me plenty of constructive feedback and lots of ways to improve. Hopefully, you can learn something anyway from my mistakes. I've also posted the query letter up on the Joined Up website, joinedupwriting.co.uk, so you can take a look at what Kate had to work with. Other than that, how's everyone coping in the continuingly surreal times that we're living through? Hope you're all staying healthy and positive and that you and your families are okay. Following on from some of Kate's observations and some other feedback I've had recently, I'm also trying to sharpen up my synopsis for safe hands. I've also been doing lots of Zoom and Skype calls, like I'm sure lots of you have out there. And I even managed to write a vaguely lockdown-themed song. So if you're a sucker for soppy songs sung by bearded writers, then you can find that over on my Twitter at Mr. Kelly2U. I think I retweeted it at JU Podcast as well. I'm also in the early stages of planning some more YouTube content for the podcast, and I'm considering putting together some kind of live show, including guests and maybe some other pre-recorded content. It's still in the planning stages, so let me know what you'd like to see by dropping me a line at wayne@waynekellywrites.com or tweeting your ideas to @JUPodcast. Also, don't forget to join the email mailing list at joinedupwriting.co.uk to get free stuff and be the first to find out about upcoming shows and events. Right, let's get to today's interview with Kate Harrison. So Kate's the author of 20 fiction and non-fiction books, including the 5-2 Diet book, The Secret Shopper's Revenge, and the Soul Beach trilogy for teenagers. She also writes thrillers as Kate Helm and books for writers, with the latest being Pitch Power, Discover What Makes Your Book Irresistible and How to Sell It, which is out right now. So here's our chat, recorded a couple of weeks ago, just an hour before the UK was put into coronavirus lockdown. Enjoy. Okay, Kate, thanks a million for joining me on Joined Up Writing. Really appreciate it. So just to start us off, why don't you tell us where you're actually speaking from and how things are going, at least from a writerly point of view, because I think we know how everything else is going in the world at the minute.
Blimey, we really do, don't we? So I am sitting here in our little house in Brighton, down by the seaside in England, and it's been a fantastically sunny day. So we have been out, just two of us, keeping a distance from everyone else with our little dog, who is a bit of a muse, or certainly a good distraction when it comes to the writing.
Yeah, excellent. Well, that's good. Getting out, looking after your mental and physical well-being, but maintaining your social distancing, that's good. So why don't you start us off, just tell us about your latest non-fiction book, Pitch Power, and we're going to be touching on it in a little bit more detail later on when we maybe have a go at looking at my own cover letter and some of my pitch bits and pieces. But for now, just tell us what it's all about and what made you want to write this book.
Sure. Well, it's called Pitch Power, Discover What Makes Your Book Irresistible and How to Sell It. But I guess it's much more than about the selling. It's also about everything that is motivating you to write your book and all the emotional and practical things that your book might deliver to a reader, and kind of identifying those and working out then how to introduce the right readers and maybe the right publishing professionals as well, people like agents and publishers, by producing a perfect pitch. And although I've written non-fiction before, it's actually my first specific book for writers. And the reason I decided to do it was I am a really unusual writer in that I really like pitching, and I love to write pitches and blurbs as well. And that is incredibly rare. Most authors I know, published and unpublished, loathe this bit, but I love it. If anything, I love it more than writing the book itself. Apart from everything else, it doesn't take nearly as long.
And why do you think that is? Do you think that comes from to do with your other background? Because I know you worked in TV for a while as well.
Yes, I think it really relates to that. So the last job that I did before I became a full-time writer, that's nearly 10 years ago now, was working in TV development. So that was at the BBC, and it was our job to come up with new ideas for factual programmes. So not dramas, but documentaries and leisure shows, that kind of thing. And as part of that, you would do a bit of sitting around on beanbags, kind of thinking about issues of the day and also things that were interesting the audience and slots that needed to be filled. And then you would create a programme idea and you would hone the idea to a particular audience and a particular slot and channel. And I really loved doing that because I could use my imagination, but also I could, as well as create the programme, I could start to put myself in the mindset of the viewer. Mm-hmm. And then when I started to become an author, when I first had my book published, my debut came out in 2003, and publishing could not have been more different in terms of, at that point, no one at all thought about what the reader was doing. Commissioning was done on the basis, in most cases, the basis of what the editor quite fancied at the time, which is fine because editors are brilliant people who have a real sense of story, but they weren't necessarily looking outside that publishing world. Things have changed, but I think that as an author, we can still use our imagination to kind of put ourselves in the mindset of what a reader might like, and then come up with something and understand what it is that we're writing and kind of connect the two together.
Absolutely. And it's quite, as you say, you mention it there, it's not just about pitching stuff about after you've written the book and blurb and all that kind of stuff. It can actually help you when you're starting out and when you're first thinking about the book for yourself.
It totally does. This is how I start almost every book. Again, perhaps because of having done that development side of things. When I start to get an idea, almost the first thing I do is to write a blurb. So that's the bit on the back of the book, or the description you'd see on Amazon. And that really starts to get me a sense, even if I don't know really what the idea is yet, it starts me making decisions, because a bit like when you're starting to write and you're faced with a blank page, when you're developing the initial idea, it can feel a bit overwhelming, and you almost need to start cutting down on the possible choices and working out what kind of book it's going to be, what genre it's going to be, what the dilemma the main character faces is, what the tone of the experience is going to be like. And that's one of the things I think is really key for me, certainly, and for a lot of authors that I work with, because I do quite a bit of mentoring and teaching. And it's thinking, what experience is the reader looking for when they go hunting for a book, when they go on Amazon or they go into a bookshop? And how am I going to deliver that experience to the max so that they feel, if they're picking up a crime book or a romance, that this is delivering the emotional stuff that they maybe didn't even quite know they wanted. But at the beginning, they're getting it. In the middle, they're getting it. And especially at the end, they've got it so they think, wow, I want to tell my friends about it, or I want to go and look at the other things that this author has written.
Absolutely. I mean, I've kind of, even before, like, just in terms of writing a logline, I mean, I don't go so far, I haven't been as far as you in terms of writing a blurb and going that far with it. But even I found it quite useful earlier on, before I'd finished the book, trying to write like what we call it in TV and film, we often call it like a log line, you know, that just kind of sums it up in 2 or 3 sentences maybe. And I did find that useful when I was writing the book, because often it would be like the anchor, it would be the thing that I could kind of go back to and think, hang on, this is what your story, at least this is what you're setting out your story to be. This is where the key driving force is. This is your protagonist. This is their main goal, or this is the thing that they're after, and kind of using that to go back. I did find it useful, so I can definitely see the use in why what you're talking about would be so useful. I can definitely see the power of that.
It's kind of like a roadmap. And I think it's really common what you're describing, especially for newer writers. In a debut novel, often we've got so much to say and we've wanted to write for such a long time that we're almost chucking everything in, including the kitchen sink. Mm-hmm. And that's great for you, but it's not great for the reader, mm-hmm. because, and also it's not great for you long term as a writer, because you still want to have stuff left over to write your second novel and your third, and in my case, my 15th or whatever it is I'm on now. And so don't chuck it all in there, but having a good log line or having that blurb can be the touchstone. When you go back to it and go, oh yes, that's what this book was meant to be about. It doesn't mean you can't change it. No. And that's the other really important thing to say. If you're using this as a way of setting up the idea, it might be that the book that you think you're writing at the beginning is quite different than the one that you end up writing, and that's okay. And that's about, again, connecting with what often the kind of stories that you like to listen to or to read or to watch, and also connecting with the kind of story you want to tell.
And have you had that experience yourself amongst all those books that you've written? Have you had it where you've started off, you thought, this is the book that I'm writing, and at some point you realise that's not the book you're writing, and you've had to change course, or at least change the style or maybe the tone of it?
I think the tone more than the story itself. Mm-hmm. There is a separate issue there where once you finished a book and you hand it over to the book trade, to agents and publishers, they might tell you that you're writing something quite different from what you thought you were writing. Yeah. But in terms of my own experience, often I will realise that perhaps a character, if I'm trying to write something uplifting, I might try and go so deep into the emotional truth that it becomes quite downhearted. I've got a quite a good example. So my second novel, The Starter Marriage, mm-hmm. it starts off with a character who her friends call her Tip Top Tess, and she's very clean and she's very tidy, she's very organised. And in the opening scene, her husband has left her quite some time ago, and she's retreated into her house and it's a terrible mess. And so she's aware of this, takeaway containers everywhere, dust bunnies under the sofa, the anathema, the opposite of what she's normally like. And I wrote that scene, and when I read it back after a while, I realised that I'd tonally gone really dark, and that actually what I was trying to write, which was women's fiction, bittersweet women's fiction, which was what that book was, I'd gone a bit too far along the bitter and not so far along the sweet. And coming back to that and realising that this book was meant to reflect my mindset, I think, which is that life has highs and lows. Sure. You can have funny stuff happening even in the midst of tragedy. I'd gone a bit too far down the tragedy line.
And so you kind of had to reel it in a little bit.
Just a tiny bit. And it's funny, I gave it to a friend to look at as well. And it might only be, this is another thing that I've learned through editing over the years, is that sometimes it's only 2 or 3 lines that you need to change or remove, where you've gone a little bit too far, that completely change the tone of a chapter, and especially an opening.
Absolutely. So, what the other thing that I think a lot of writers, myself included to a certain extent, especially when it's your book and it's your baby and it's your thing that you've written, sometimes it's very, very hard to be able to see your book, think about your book. We often talk about, when we talk about like doing a cover letter or speaking to agents or whatever, tell us where your book would go, which shelf it would go on, and which books it would be next to, and all those kind of things. And I think sometimes it feels quite difficult to do, because it's your book. It's not that you think your book's necessarily incredibly original or something, but it's often you don't always have a clear sense of what your book is, whereas somebody else probably does that's not as attached to it. Does that make sense?
It totally does. And so what often goes into a pitch or a cover letter is what we call the comps, the comp titles, the comparators or the comparisons. Yeah. And those are really important when you are submitting to an agent, but also increasingly, if you are self-publishing your book, you need to get those comps right as well, because you're using those as a way of indicating to a reader, if you like this, you might like that. And it is a bit trial and error. You are often going to look at it and think, oh, well, I think I'm writing like Stephen King, say, and then actually you're realizing when you go through it, and after you've had a bit of space away from a book, often you need to go away from it for a little while and then come back to it and reread it, that it's not like you haven't got quite the darkness of Stephen King, say, or there's a humorous element to it that's a bit different. Mm-hmm. We do talk about, when you're choosing comps, quite often about the X meets Y. Mm-hmm. And this kind of pitch is more notorious in Hollywood. Yeah. So you might have that, they talk about the elevator pitch, which is when you accidentally or fortuitously step into a lift with a top studio executive. Obviously not the kind of studio executive that we've been hearing a lot about recently. That wouldn't be lucky at all.
I was just thinking but this
is one that you really want to spend time with and not in a lift.
Let's say a nice female executive rather than...
Yeah, a lovely female.
The one we were all thinking about, yeah.
Executive, yeah. Who's going to take you... You've only got a certain number of floors and you need to be pitching quickly and really excitingly, so that by the time you come and the doors are opening, they're going, no, send me, this is my email address, send me this work straight away.
Yeah.
What tends to happen with those kind of comps so often is that we're going for the extreme, almost with comedy value. It will things like it might be things like Jaws in space. That's one of the classic ones.
Yeah,
that's pretty good, but sometimes it goes way too extreme. Mm-hmm. It might be Eleanor Oliphant meets, I'm trying to think of something insane. Jaws. I don't know. That is pretty, that is, naturally we laugh at that. And so you don't want that unless you are really actively going for that madcap tone. I think that research, and Amazon has provided us a perfect tool for this, can really help you with understanding where you sit in the market. And then maybe kind of reading short excerpts, even if they're authors that you don't particularly know. You can sit down and have a look through those first chapters and think, okay, tonally, is my book similar to this one? If I'm going to read that first chapter, is it offering something that's similar? So if you're thinking about women's fiction, for example, and although we can take issue with the term, it's one that the publishing industry uses.
Yeah.
If you look at some of those women's fiction writers, look at where you're going to be sitting on that. I'm just looking at my bookshelf right now. So you've got somebody like Dorothy Coomson on one end, who has got quite relationship-based, friendship-based drama, and there's always a mystery in the middle of it. And it can be quite bitter. Mm-hmm. There can be quite difficult issues that are being looked at along the way. At the other end, you've got Katie Ford, whose books are a safe space.
Sure.
It's the kind of books that a lot of people are taking refuge with in difficult times, as we are now.
Yeah.
There are romances where the characters are really fantastic.
Yeah.
Bad things might happen to them, but you have got that certainty that it will all come good. Mm-hmm. Where maybe with Dorothy's books, it will be resolved, but you might face, or the characters might face
pain along
the way. Exactly.
Yeah. And so it's getting those the correct sort of one. So it can be kind of potentially then quite a risky strategy using the comparison titles, the comp titles. Do you think
it's not a risky strategy? Because actually, I think it's something that you need to be across, because it's something that agents will expect, and you don't necessarily put it in the X meets Y. You can say readers who enjoy. Yeah. The complex relationship-based mysteries of Dorothy Coomson may enjoy my book, alongside those who love, say, the exotic escapism of a Dinah Jeffries book, say, mm-hmm. for example, who is writing often historical books in unusual, quite often ex-colonial settings. And so then you've got that thing there. Instantly, I know what that is. I know that it's almost transposing what Dorothy does into an exotic, perhaps historical locale. That isn't dangerous if you've got it right.
I think that's the key, isn't it? But then I guess that's the key with all of this stuff. It's kind of not leading them maybe down the wrong path and then them being disappointed.
Exactly, both readers and also agents and publishers. Now, agents and publishers, if you've got something that is compelling, will forgive you. So if you have given them some comps that are perhaps slightly off the mark, but are still intriguing and interesting, they see that as a job, agents as well. Agents want to know that you're market aware, but they also want to offer something extra for their 15%. They like to get involved. They like to do something to help put your book into the best possible shape. So even if you get those comps slightly wrong, they will often come back and say, actually, your book reminded me a bit more of XYZ. Mm-hmm. And that's good news because those books are in vogue at the moment. And I know an editor who's looking for this.
And they can put you in the right sort of direction. Mm-hmm. Just off air, I mentioned that I'd been having a bit of a dig around your website. And one of the things I was looking at was the diary of an unpublished author aged 33 3/4, which is excellent. And it's kind of got a few diary entries giving a kind of overview of your journey, your writing journey and your first novel and how you went about getting it published. And obviously, as you mentioned before, that was sort of back in 2002, 2003. So obviously since then you've had to pitch loads of books, both fiction and non-fiction. So what would you say has changed along the way, and what have you learned along the way? What would you say you were doing then that you're not doing now, or you've refined and you're doing maybe in a better way now?
I think that there are two sides of this to me. One is about the concept and the hook of the book itself, which is something I talk about in Pitch Power, but you'll hear authors talk about it all the time. And the other one is about editing. So starting with that hook, I've always been quite a hooky writer. So I've always wanted to reflect in a story something that's going on at the time. Maybe it comes from my development time, maybe it's just because I enjoy writing commercial contemporary fiction. So my first novel I was writing it around the time that we were all starting to get into Friends Reunited. Mm-hmm. If anyone remembers that was the first social network, really.
It was
before Facebook became a big thing. I think Facebook was just starting around that time, but it had become quite a big deal, Friends Reunited. And there was also quite a big craze in London where I was living at the time for these school disco type events where you'd go, people in their 20s and 30s would go and listen to the music that was coming from the 80s and 90s and dressed in school uniform. It was kind of Britney Spears had a lot to answer for as well in that video. But, it seems bizarre now, 20 years ago, that we were doing this, but we were. And so I decided to write a book about a school reunion. And that in itself was a little bit of a hook. And the hook there was that the heroine was somebody who thought she was the most popular girl in the school, and actually when she started to organise the school reunion, it becomes evident to the reader that actually everybody hated her because she was a bully. Mm-hmm. And so you've got that build up to this school reunion. So I've always had a bit of a hook, but I think that some of my books have been less hooky than others. And now what I've really realised is whether you are an unpublished writer or whether you are on your 20th book, unless you are in that, say, top 20 of household name authors, every single book has to have that USP, unique selling point, that really hooky story question that makes everyone involved in the process, from the agent all the way through to the reader in the bookshop, go, oh, I have to get hold of that book in order to answer that question, to know what's going to happen next.
Absolutely.
So that's the hook side. And I've become a lot more conscious of that when I'm trying to put a book together. And then on the other side is much simpler, is the editing thing. I edit much more. I used to think, and many first-time writers think this, that writing a book was writing a book. Mm-hmm. And now I realise that writing a book really is editing the book. Yeah. There are a few incredible storytellers who do it naturally. Jill Mansell is one of those people. She just sits down and she writes in front of the telly, I think. And she hasn't planned anything, and she does very little editing. Well, she's lucky, and well, she's rare. The rest of us, we have to work hard at the editing. But the plus side of that is that it means you can write something really super messy, let the ideas come through, whether you like to plot a lot or not, let the ideas and the characters develop, and then come back to what your hook was, what your initial idea was, and then edit the hell out of the book, bearing that in mind.
Absolutely. And what I'm getting from especially you're talking about hooks, it's that question part that's really important, isn't it? It's like, what is that question? It's setting that question that they can't fail to want to answer.
Yes. Yeah, and in a thriller, it's quite often who done it or why done it, or even how is that possible. A lot of Sophie Hannah's books, for example, start off with an absolutely impossible premise. I forget the name of her new one, but it's where you meet a woman 10 years after you last saw her, and there she is with her kids, and her kids are exactly the same age as they were the last time you saw her.
Right. Brilliant.
Who doesn't want to know the answer to that?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. It's almost like a Twilight Zone or something. It sets it up right at the beginning.
Yeah.
So what about your actual writing process? You mentioned about editing obviously has become more important to you, but tell us a bit about your process anyway. You kind of alluded to it there, and I know we talked about it a good few years ago when we first met, and I made a film about you, The Life of a Writer. Tell us a little bit about that. How much do you plan, and sort of, what's your favourite part of the process?
It probably is coming up with the idea, actually.
Yeah.
And writing that blurb. And then quite often I like writing the beginning as I get to know the characters. And then I love writing the end.
Literally the words, the end. Yeah.
The end. Or the last sentence or whatever. And
yeah.
I do actually quite like the editing now. But my process is, I do need a bit of a plan. I do need to have that confidence that I've got a little bit of an outline so that I know what I'm going to put in the next chapter. And that will change as I go through. But I like to know roughly what the storyline is going to be. I will have an idea that's come from nowhere. If it stays with me for a few days, and if I'm right in the middle of another book, I'll write that down, just that germ of that idea, and try and suppress it, because the idea, every writer knows that the idea that you haven't yet started is so much more desirable
always
than the thing you're working on at the time, especially if you're in the dreaded kind of saggy middle bit. Yeah. So I'll do that. But if I'm at the planning point, then I will start brainstorming some ideas. I'll start thinking about the characters. I might do some post-its. I've got a whiteboard. I might use a bit of that. There is a book that I really like by Alexandra Sokolov called Screenwriting Tricks for Authors. I'm just reading that on my bookshelf at the moment. And she's got a great planning grid, and I always use that now as well, which is divided into 8, actually, 4 columns, and then a line running horizontally across them, to show you different points where a dramatic moment might happen. Yeah. So I do try that. I'm quite focused on the midpoint now. So even with women's fiction, you might want a big reversal in the middle, or something really fundamental to happen right in the middle. I am a bit obsessed with story theory and things like that, and I always quite often look for a new book to read when I'm in the middle of plotting something, to kind of, in the hope that it's going to give me that magic trick that's going to make it super easy this time.
Never is, though, is it?
Never is. But then sometimes, the most recent book that I have finished is called How to Save a Life, and that is a book that I've written, as you say, I've written a bit of crime, I've written a bit of YA, thrillers, non-fiction, diet books. And this is my first epic love story, epic in the way that it goes across 20 years. Mm-hmm. That was murder to plot, okay, because I've got 3 characters who start off on Hove Lawns, not far from where I live right now, on Millennium Eve, and one of them suffers a cardiac arrest. So they die, effectively, in front of the others, playing football. Mm-hmm. And one person steps in to save their life, and one person freezes. And it's what happens to those 3 characters between 1999 and 2018. So these are 3 lives with so many moments in them. And so to plan that one was really difficult, because I had to try and pick when to catch up with them, when not to catch up with them. I had to plot all the things that were happening in their careers, in their love lives, where they were living, what they were doing. I ended up with that one using a tool called Aeon, which is quite good actually, especially for crime writers, but even for women's fiction writers if you're doing this sort of thing. And it's actually a timeline where you can enter something that happens. You enter their birthdays and things at the beginning, and it tells you exactly how old they are at certain points. Yeah. And it also helps you to, you can set it up so that if you move something by a year, for example, all the events that follow that will also move.
Oh, that's brilliant. And what's that called? Aeon, did you say?
Aeon, yeah. And it's used by lawyers. It costs a little. You can try it out for a month, I think, and then see how it works. But it is used for people like lawyers who are doing timelines for a criminal case as well.
Yeah.
You can see it works. Won't suit everyone. Some people, will destroy that. I for example, I tried Scrivener. I can't really get my head around it, but Aeon I really like. And that, I don't think I could have written that book without Aeon. And the other good thing is, although people have it, you don't have to have it. You can also, when it gets to publication stage, if you get that far, or you're publishing it yourself, you can export the timeline into a PDF and send it to your copy editor so that they can check that your dates, that you've not got anyone pregnant for 20 months or whatever it might be. Yeah. So that's my process with planning, and sometimes it works. And then with the editing, again with this book, I cut loads of stuff, I put loads of stuff back in. But then once you're at that point where you're writing new scenes, you can really, the characters so well that it's not that hard. And, I didn't get it totally right. I cut loads of stuff. I worked with my agent for ages on this book because we both had quite a good feeling about it. But we did a lot of work. We had input from the American agent as well, part of the same agency. And we all kind of had a bit of a month of like really in-depth kind of editing, adding stuff in, getting rid of things, and it worked. I mean, after all this time, you can teach an old dog new tricks, I think, because that book kind of sold kind of really, really well. I got a really good American deal for that. I had a UK auction going on between publishers here, and that has never happened to me before. I've had some great successes with my books, but this was really exciting. This was all the things that you want to happen.
It does sound really interesting. It sort of sounds like it's ready-made for film or TV as well, just from the idea.
That'd be nice. We'll see.
It does sound.
I mean, it does come from it totally comes from my passion. So my thing for ages has also been that I am addicted to shows like 24 Hours and A&E and Grey's Anatomy.
Yeah,
I love those, real and the fictional, and that doesn't exist in book form at the moment, apart from Mills and Boon medical romances, which a lot of people absolutely love, but it's not really my sort of thing. I prefer something a bit longer and a bit less focused just on the romance.
Yeah. And
so this is my answer to those. I mean, whether people will want to read about medical stuff in a year's time is another thing, but you write what you have at the time. And what I also wanted to write, my mum was a nurse. A member of my family, the idea that came about because I had to do CPR on a member of my family who survived. Wow. So it came from a very personal place for me. Wow. And I also wanted to write about the heroes in our health service who did everything they could to save this person's life and ensure they have a really good quality of life, unaltered now. And so I like to think that hopefully people will want to read that.
I think they will, especially on that last point, as you say. I mean, that's very much in the focus of everyone's mind at the moment, as those same people that are on the front line and having to deal with what they're having to deal with at the minute. So I definitely think people want to read about it. So kind of on that subject, obviously you mentioned that you write in so many different genres, and you write fiction and you write non-fiction, and you've got various different pen names, haven't you? So why don't you just give us a quick rundown of those pen names and just tell it. I know that I've spoken to other authors about this in the past. They always seem torn about the fact they've got many pen names. On one way, and on one respect, it's good because you've got segmentation in the market and everything else. But on another hand, it gets very confusing and difficult to manage. How do you feel about it? Just give us a rundown of the names first of all.
Okay, so there's my name, which is my actual name, Kate Harrison, and obviously that was my women's fiction to start with, and my YA, and then I started writing these diet books 7 years ago, and they did incredibly well under my name, and it's then become confusing because if you put my name into Amazon or other online bookshops, you're going to get 5-2 Diet and this kind of stuff come up. Uh-huh. So then with my thrillers that I write for Bonnier UK, I decided to keep my first name, which is still Kate, and become Kate Helm in honour of my adopted city, Helmstone, Brighton. Yeah. So she writes kind of psychological thrillers, but kind of a bit unusual. So one about a courtroom artist, and then one I've got coming out in May called The House Share. So that's a kind of toxic house share thing. Again, perhaps a bit too relevant for where we are at the moment. You certainly would not want to be locked in with any of the people in my book. No lockdown there. Kate Helm. And then for the new books, we have gone with a completely different name, although it does relate to family names, and that is Eva Carter. And again, that's just because Kate Helm is crime books. You're going to get a very different flavour, and I don't want people to get confused with the diet books either. So it remains to be seen how that works out. But yes, it is because it's doing something quite new. It's not a big secret, but equally it is a different brand, I suppose, a different feeling. And although I was thinking about it the other day because I have ideas sometimes, and I could go either way with them. I could go Kate Helm and go a bit scary and a bit dark and a bit toxic. Mm-hmm. Or I could go Eva Carter and go kind of struggle, kind of choices, dilemmas, ultimate emotional payoff. So do you want to be scared? Go for Kate Helm. You want to be you want to cry? Go for Eva Carter, but hopefully cry with a sort of feeling that everything will be okay in the end.
And I guess that kind of comes back to the pitch power idea again, and that's kind of another tool that you've got in your particular toolbox, because you have got these other things to play with as well in terms of your pen names and how you're gonna, do they help you? They're kind of levers, aren't they? Really, in terms of helping you steer it in whichever direction you want to go in at the time.
They are. I call it benefit, which comes from my TV days and also comes from marketing speak a little bit. Although, when people talk about things like pitching or hard sells, I back away from that immediately, because that's not what this is about. It's not about writing to the market or being really ruthless. It's about tapping into the emotional side. But the emotional benefit for the reader is what they're going to get out of a book. So if it's going to be a thriller, even within thrillers, there's so many different kinds, but a thriller is going to be something where you don't want to be able to put it down. You're distracted from everything else that's going on because you want to get to the end of a mystery. I often think of those books as being the ones you want to pick up before you get on a really long plane journey, so that by the end of it, the time will pass so quickly. It could also work in lockdown at the moment, but equally, a page turner could be a page turner because it's deeply, deeply emotional. And, if it's a rom-com, we're laughing because we can see this couple who need to be together, but they're kind of constantly messing it up. And we are simultaneously getting frustrated with them because they're not cottoning on to what they need to be doing. But we're also really on their side. We're yearning for them to do whatever it is that they need to do, maybe make some change in themselves or change in their lives in order to be the perfect other half for the person that we see them falling out with in the book. That can also be a page turner, but it's a very different emotional experience. And what you're looking at there is the benefit. It works for non-fiction as well. So it's more clear in some ways in non-fiction. If you're writing a diet book, the benefit will be that you're going to help your reader to find a way of managing their eating and feeling healthier and feeling better about themselves. If you are teaching them Spanish, they're going to be able to speak Spanish. But the emotional benefit could be that they're going to be able to talk to their Spanish parents-in-law that at the moment they can't speak to, or they're going to be able to plan their trip around the world, or they're going to be able to improve their working relationship because they're working for a Spanish company. So it's not just about the thing, it's also about the emotional benefit that that's going to achieve for them, how they're going to feel and what they're going to be able to do after the book. There's just one more point about the Eva Carter book.
Mm-hmm.
My own emotional journey about writing that book was to make people want to learn CPR.
Yeah.
It wasn't about saying, "Oh, I'm going to write a very serious and worthy non-fiction book," but it was a side benefit to think, I hope that after reading this book and seeing what's possible, but also seeing how low the survival rates are from people who've had a cardiac arrest, that they're going to want to go and do that and to be empowered to do that. And often really good fiction will give you some extra information along with it. So, it might be telling you about a different part of the world that you're not, especially if you're reading fiction in that's been translated or that's coming from a different cultural outlook from your own, or it might be something factual about history, and where you've got that benefit as well. That's brilliant.
So in terms of coming up with those for your own work, as you say, non-fiction is a bit easier, not so much with the emotional side of things, but it's easier to think about it in terms of what the direct benefit is, because it's often that's the purpose of the book. But with fiction and trying to think about what you want those emotional aspects to be, how do you go about that? Do you think about books that you maybe enjoyed in the same genre or that are similar to that, or like in you were talking specifically with that book, you were talking about some of the TV shows that you like. Did you then sit down and think, well, why do I like those shows? What is it I like about them? How do they make me feel? Did you kind of go down that track?
I didn't make it quite that methodical, although it's something that you can do as part of your research, particularly for books, where either at the beginning or on your journey, if you're starting out with writing and you're not quite sure where you're going with your writing, because as I've said, certain stories, a story, for example, about a courtroom artist could be a thriller, or it could be a historical book, or it could be a love story. It could be any of those things. And often you'll have an idea. And if you're new to writing, you may not understand where you're going with it. So often looking at what the emotional benefits some of your own favourite books offer and why you as a reader love them can be a really good way of understanding what it is you want to write. For me, I suppose it's there in the background when I'm actually doing the writing. When I come back to it, if I've got an editing decision, for example, I might think, okay, am I going to kill this character off? Mm-hmm. How does this, if there's an issue there, if there's a question there about whether I should kill somebody off or not, what is truest to what the reader might want, while at the same time surprising them? So I don't want to suddenly kill off my main character halfway through, because that's going to really annoy them, and that's sort of taking you away from almost the contract you have with the reader. Unless you are known for that kind of book, unless you are deliberately doing that, it's a bit like anyone who watched the now vintage BBC spy series Spooks.
Yeah, we just started rewatching it actually.
Oh, I love it, don't you? But
yeah,
the first episode, okay, so it is a minor spoiler alert, but you get to know one of I think it is episode 1, isn't it?
It's episode 2, but
episode 2.
But yeah, it's really, which obviously is really, really early on in the series.
It's really early on, and we're really getting to know these characters, and we're loving them, and we think they're fantastic, and they're brave enough they are. And one of the characters, who is slightly annoying actually at times, but they are suddenly killed by having their head submerged in a deep fat fryer.
Yeah. Okay,
so that tells you something about what Spooks is going to be like.
Yes. The story that I heard about that, actually, as a slight diversion, I don't know how true this is, and I've got a feeling that many, many years ago when that first came out, I think I had it on DVD, and I think it was part of the DVD extras that I heard this story from one of the producers, was that when they were delivering the scripts to the BBC, the deadline was coming up for that episode, and they'd basically got into a quandary with that story, and they'd written themselves into a corner with it, and they didn't know how to get out of it. and they had to deliver the script because the deadline was coming up. And in desperation, they said, why don't we just kill her? We'll hand it in. If there's a big problem with it anyway, they'll say, and we can change it and whatever, but we need to hit the deadline. So they just... Now, how that might be apocryphal, obviously, but I did like that kind of story, and that's kind of... Because it does seem to come out of, like, desperation. It does fit, but you're completely right. And once they've done that, obviously... You're then thinking the whole time you're watching it, whichever series, obviously that went on for like 4 or 5 series or whatever it was.
Yeah,
and you're watching it, and that is always, it does add something, because you are thinking, that thing that you always get with serial dramas where you're like, well, these are main characters, so they're not going to get killed off because, the whole drama's based on them. That does remove that, and it does add a little extra level of tension. It does raise the stakes, doesn't it?
And emotionally, as you say, right the way through. Same with Line of Duty.
Yeah.
You're almost waiting for who they're going to kill off, and it gives you that woo like edge, but it does also partly keep you at arm's length, and that's interesting. So emotionally, again, some books can do that quite safely. Others, you're kind of almost like, I don't want to invest too much in the character, and I have, again, just because it's freshest in my mind, and in that How to Save a Life book, one of the people has a condition that is really serious and could catch up with him at any time. And so the ending of that book gave me a lot of, and all of us, a lot of discussions and a lot of sleepless nights as to what the realistic emotional ending is for that book. And but it's okay so long as you've set it up.
Yeah.
It's okay so long as you've set up in the reader's mind that these are the things at risk. What is going to really annoy a reader and probably send a reader to Amazon or to any other site to really slag it off is if you change the contract.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And if you did, and this is another thing that's really important about pitching a book in the broadest possible sense. Everything about it, and this is partly your publisher's job if you end up getting published, or if you're self-publishing, you have to do it yourself. Your title, your cover, your blurb, everything has to set up those expectations accurately. It doesn't mean you have to be the same as everyone else, but it does mean that you have to be honest about what it is that you're offering, because otherwise a reader might invest a lot of time in a book, and then if they're suddenly disappointed or the rug is pulled under them in a way they don't find enjoyable, they're going to often get really cross about it.
Absolutely.
And that's where you get your 1 or 2 star reviews.
Yeah, and I think again it comes back to what you were saying near the beginning about that getting the tone right, because if you've set it up that someone's reading a particular kind of genre, obviously within that, it's not that you have to be predictable, but within that, there are certain things that the reader will expect in terms of tropes, or, like you mentioned about the medical romance books that you were talking, Mills and Boone you were talking about. Obviously, people that read those, and they'll be expecting a certain kind of book when they're reading that, a certain kind of story. And if it suddenly takes a very dark turn, or somebody gets killed off like that, they're going to be apoplectic, probably.
You're not going to be able to kill the hero, as far as I know, in medical romance from Mills and Boone. That can't happen. And that's why some of these books, why people who are fans of particular genres love them so much, because they feel in a safe space. Even if it's a horror book, they feel in a safe space because they know that they're going to be shocked, but it's going to be done in a way that surprises them, hopefully, but still fits within what they love about that kind of book.
Well, now we've come back to the kind of the topic of pitching as we kind of move into the last sort of bit of the podcast. One of the things that we talked about before we got to chat today was I was going to offer myself up to the altar, and I sent you some of the stuff that I've been sending out for submitting my novel. So I don't think we're going to loads of stuff, but I thought maybe just with the cover letter, I will put this in the show notes anyway, but I'll just quickly read through the cover letter because it's not that long.
No.
So I'll read it out anyway, and then you can tell me what sort of thoughts you had on it initially. So this is about, I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but it's about my novel Safe Hands. So it's a cover letter, so dear to whoever. So I'm currently seeking representation for my debut crime novel, Safe Hands. And then I've got in bold letters, Ocean's 11 meets Long Good Friday. Safe Hands is a crime novel told in the first person by Mickey Blake. Mickey is an ageing, bitterly sarcastic safecracker who can open any vault using only his sense of touch. No tools, no explosives, and definitely no stethoscope. For the sake of his dying wife, Mickey's forced to return from South America to run-down UK seaside town for one last job. He has 5 days to help a crooked undercover cop rob a Russian mafia safe house. Then there's a quote from the book, Does the job need me or do I need the job? Featuring an irreverent older protagonist with a unique voice, Safe Hands is a fast-paced commercial fiction novel about a criminal finally having to face the consequences of his selfish life choices and the feelings of inadequacy that come with old age. With acerbic humour and an emotional undercurrent, Safe Hands is a book that deals with issues of ageing, toxic masculinity, guilt, and what it means to be a father and a husband. I see this book sitting beside other commercial crime like Steve Kavanagh's Eddie Flynn series and the Elvis Cole series by Robert Crace. I think that's how you pronounce that, by the way. Fans of TV series like Line of Duty and Breaking Bad will also enjoy this novel. Several of my short stories have been published in anthologies, and I wrote and directed an award-winning short film, Inkling. My monologues have been filmed and performed on stage. Then I talk about my podcast, mention about that, talk about what I do for my day job. So by day I work in video production, producing scripts for promotional films and documentaries. I was inspired to write Safe Hands by my desire to create a modern day British equivalent to the amoral protagonist of Richard Stark's Parker novels. Mickey's safecracking abilities are based on real-life world champion safecracker Jeff Sitar. And then I've just basically said, attached to my first 3 chapters of the book in a short synopsis on request, would be delighted to send the full manuscript. So yeah, that's kind of what I've been sending off with my submission, and then depending on whether they want a partial or a full or whatever, I've been sending that. So yeah, so kind of based on the stuff that you talk about in Pitch Power and some of your approaches and things, what were your kind of initial thoughts? What kind of stood out, good or bad or otherwise?
Okay, so I have to preface this by saying that I am not a huge reader of this genre, so some of the details of the comparator titles, for example, I can't say whether they're accurate or not.
Sure.
And so there are bits of tropes around this genre that I, although I've read 13, I don't read that Steve Kavanagh's book. I haven't read massively around this area, so take that with
sure,
in advisory really with this. What I would say is that this has got loads of good stuff going for it. So it has got almost all of the elements that I would say in Pitch Power you should have. It has got a strong hook. It has got a good title. It's got the comps. It's got a little bit of the bio. It's got a suggestion about what readers might like about it. The hook's good. I would say that it's got a bit too much of each of those elements.
Yeah.
There's a bit too much there for my liking, I think, of you telling us or telling an agent what it is.
Uh-huh.
So things like, unique voice. You're kind of veering off slightly into that thing of saying, well, that's going to be self-evident in the material.
Sure.
And so some of that is kind of, you could trim that back. I would say you could trim back some of your bio stuff as well, so that it's one paragraph, because really what a cover letter like this is doing is everything you write could give the agent an excuse not to read any further.
Sure, yeah.
Because they are manically busy. I've been into publishers and agents, and just out of interest, I've said I'd like to see, if it's okay, could I have a look at the kind of things you get in? This is in the early days because I was intrigued by it. And very quickly, I love ideas. I love new writing. I got very jaded very quickly.
Sure.
And there are certain things that flag that up. Now, there's nothing in yours that's absolutely terrible that flags up things, but there's definitely less is more when it comes to this stuff.
Yeah.
I personally would absolutely not start with Ocean's 11 meet Long Good Friday.
Yeah.
Not because of the meets element, but because you need to be talking about books, not movies at that point.
Sure.
And you've got too many references to TV and books. To TV and film, not books.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, this is not a film pitch.
Sure.
You are looking at stuff that works successfully on the
page
on the page and in Amazon, and not on a movie theatre. And it's not surprising, given your background, that you're doing that. But I would say in general, so when I put a reference to Grey's Anatomy in mine, it was in amongst lots of books.
Sure.
Because these people are publishers. I think that things like talking about what you're inspired by, I don't know Richard Stark's Parker novels.
Yeah.
What you're saying, you're hinting that they go back a little bit in time.
Mm-hmm.
Your comp titles need to be really contemporary, because you need to be talking about what the market is right now, not what it was and how you're trying to recreate something that there was.
Yeah.
Because that kind of makes it seem like you might not be totally
of now. Yeah.
And you actually want to write into a market that's there at the moment, or to show where you fit in that market, not try and create a new market. Despite what I said about trying to create medical fiction, my book has enough in that, hopefully, to not rely on me creating a whole new genre. You know what I mean?
I do, yeah, totally.
I think the biggest issue for me reading this is I don't know if I'm meant to like Mickey or not. And maybe it's less of an issue for in this particular sub area of the thriller and crime market. That's why I said that this is not one I know. But actually, even if you look at Eddie Flynn, and I looked up the Robert Crace novels as well, having seen this, they are still they've often, if they've got a dodgy background, they've still ended up on the right side of the law. This guy is very definitely on the wrong side of the law.
Yeah.
So why am I going to, if not like him, at least empathise with him? Is it because he's funny? You've said he's sarcastic, but you said he's bitterly sarcastic. It becomes, you're almost giving me reasons to think this is going to be a really difficult character to live with, to spend time with. And as 70% of fiction readers are women. Do you see what I'm saying about this? I don't really know if it's going to be.
I do know what you're saying.
Comedy around him that is going to keep me going, and yet when I've read the synopsis, it's not very comic. It's really quite dark.
Yeah.
There's also an element, you mentioned the fact he's aging about 6 times in this synopsis, in this letter, and then when I look at the synopsis, he's 58.
Yeah.
Come on, mate. He might be aging in the crime world. I'm in my 50s now, albeit my early 50s. I don't see myself as aging.
I'm in my mid-40s. I'm not that far behind.
And you're sort of talking about, and you're really going on about that, about the theme. I would have those quite subtle, be a little bit more subtle about those, and tell us, are we going to want to spend time with this character because he's a lovable rogue? Because he's more moral, or at Long Good Friday, because he's more moral than other people, that he's still got that moral content, that sort of places him above some of those other people. At the moment, I don't feel that. And when I also read the synopsis, which I know you're not going to post, but again, you've just got to look at that stuff. He doesn't come across as very nice. There's something that comes up really early on that he does that sort of makes me hate him even more.
Yeah, I think I know what that is. Yeah.
Yeah. He comes across as a bit of a sexist pig because of the way that he's treating women, and the way that you're, there is potential there. And bearing in mind that so many readers are women, and that so many people who are agents are women, you've got to be quite careful about that stuff. And some of them might be a bit older as well.
Yeah.
They might be in their 50s as well, and they might be thinking, I don't know that I'm, the feelings of inadequacy that come with old age.
Yeah.
So I think if you can give us a bit more of a sense, maybe it's there a little bit in your comp titles, of, again, emotional benefit. Yeah. What is the tone of this book? What is he like? And then keep that, have the courage of your convictions, but make people feel that there's going to be a reason that we're going to spend time with this guy, even if he's an anti-hero. Anti-heroes can be brilliant, but at the moment I don't think that he's leaping off enough. His specialist skill is fascinating, but I want to know something else more about him. the save the cat philosophy. He's got all these kind of downsides. We've seen that he's being forced to return from South America. Too much detail, by the way. We're not interested in where he is in that thing.
Yeah.
We're just interested in the now, because the minute I read South America, I'm thinking, oh, there's a drugs connection. It's going to be, you're giving, when you're giving specific information, choose the specifics so that you're not taking people in a direction that's not actually relevant.
Yeah, I'd say, yeah, that's good.
So think about the emotional benefit. I had one more thought, actually, which might make this interesting. Rather than talking about novels that you would like to create a modern day equivalent of, I would mention the Hatton Garden robbery here. Yeah. Because those people, obviously there's been quite a lot, I wouldn't put it as your top line, there have been quite a lot of dramatisations of this big robbery that, if people don't know what it was carried out by a group of over 50s and in some cases over 70s. That's why I was quite surprised that he was only 58.
Yeah.
And what's been really interesting about that was that with lots of dramas, lots of books, none of them really got into the psyche of those people, because mostly they were quite nasty.
Yeah.
They were not lovable rogues. This was not Ocean's 11. So if you can give us a feeling, perhaps that in this book you're going to go into more the psyche of those kind of people, instantly that's much more interesting to me.
Yeah, that's really good. They're really good tips. Thanks for that. Now, that's a really good point as well, about, because that is something I've actually been wrestling with in general, the likability factor. And obviously, if it's coming over even worse in the cover letter and the synopsis, then that's something that needs to be addressed. So that's really helpful.
Good.
Yeah,
I think you've got the elements there, but you need to be taking a zoom further out, or kind of more of a helicopter view as an agent, and that's what's hard to do as a reader. As a writer, it's hard as a writer to take that helicopter view of what you are offering to somebody. But I guess that's what I'm trying to do in these sort of tools, is to take a little zoom out. Absolutely.
Well, that's really, really helpful. Thank you for that. So, and I will post that up. I will, true to my word, I will post that up and people can have a look, and maybe I'll post up another draft of it further down the line when I've taken.
I'd love to see that.
Parts. Yeah, definitely. Definitely when I've taken your advice on board. So that's really, really helpful. So as we kind of move to wrap things up, so just give us a sense of what you're working on at the minute. What's coming up next? I know you mentioned you've obviously got some books that are coming out that are already kind of in the publishing machine and will be coming out in due course. So can you give us a hint of what you're actually working on now, or not?
Oh, yes, definitely. So I have planned out another Kate Helm novel, but that may change really given certain circumstances. I've got a feeling that the kind of things that we want from our thrillers are going to be, I think the kind of things we want from our fiction overall are going to change quite dramatically as a result of this international crisis that we're in. Just the sense of how we feel about the world is going to change. So, and that was slightly my next project anyway. That was kind of the next project but one. I am currently writing my second Eva Carter novel, which again has a medical background, but it's not involving doctors and other medics, which the first book does. It is contemporary, but instead of being set over 20 years, it's set over 1 month. And it's about 3 people who come together when they're in the middle of some stuff that is going to completely change their future. And how they come together and are later kind of pushed apart by secrets. And thematically, it's about whether you can live in the present, trying to learn to live in the present rather than the past or the future.
That's brilliant. What would you, for people that are out there listening and that are just maybe starting out, maybe they're at the point where they're either just finishing that first draft or maybe they're just about to start that first draft, and coming again back to your pitch power book and thinking about how they should think about the story and the idea and where they're going to take it. Have you got any kind of final words of wisdom or some advice for them?
I think that it comes out in almost every story theory book that you read, and it's really important when you're plotting but also when you're editing, is to look at your central character or characters and to identify what their central flaw or what their central conflict is, and make sure that the book is dealing with the struggle that they have with that all the way through, because that's how we empathise. We empathise with people who have something to overcome and who are facing difficulties. And, you know, whatever the genre is, it might be a practical, physical difficulty when it comes to, you know, a spy trying to track down somebody who's about to put the world in danger, or it might be a mother and son trying to relate to each other despite pain that's gone before. But identifying what that is and then what the associated story question is to do with that. Find your story question, that the question that the reader will only get the answer to if they read your book. And that then can lead you all the way through all the decisions that you take, whether it's the title or whether it's the cover.
That's great advice. That's really good advice to sort of end on. So just remind people where they can find you online, Kate.
I am at Kate Writes Books on Twitter and Instagram, and you can also find me on YouTube. I am planning to add some extra videos to YouTube at some point, although I haven't done that yet. Or you find me on my website, kate-harrison.com.
Well, that's brilliant. Well, good luck with all your projects coming up. So many of them to go at. And it was great to chat to you. Thanks again, Kate.
It's been a pleasure. Cheers, Wayne.
Okay, thanks again to Kate, and you should definitely check out her Pitch Power book. It's full of loads of useful advice, and I'll put that and all the other links in the show notes over at joineduprighting.co.uk. That's it for this week, but don't forget you can find the entire back catalogue of interviews on the website. Make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts from to have the podcast downloaded automatically every time. Also, remember to get in touch with all your writing news, views, questions or comments, and I'll give you a mention in a future show. Next week, I'm chatting to TV comedy writer and performer Julian Dutton. But until then, please stay home and stay safe. I'm Wayne Kelly, happy writing and reading, and I'll see you next time.